Welcome to another episode of Fresh Thinking with Snowden Optiro. This is the third of three podcasts in which we're exploring various aspects of sampling, and I'm very privileged again to be joined by Mark Murphy. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you, flattered to be here.
Mark is well known to some, if not all of you. In this third podcast, we're going to talk about what happens in that big dark box that we call the processing plant. Specifically, Mark and I are going to talk about what geologists need to know about plant sampling. And here we're talking about metallurgical balance, reconciliation, and so on. So we know that there's many aspects of plant sampling, right? And the Mets have got a lot of things to think about. But as a geologist, say someone who does reconciliation, which bits of the plant or which parts of the sampling are the most important things to focus on or understand as a geologist?
Yep, very good question. Never trust a metallurgist is my recommendation. They have a different agenda to geologists. So in terms of the plant, not so much sampling, probably the key issue is two things going into the plant: moisture and mass, and how are they being measured? Because if the amount of mass going into the mill is assessed to be higher than it really is, you're going to get the flack on the reconciliation, okay? And if it's lower, well, don't tell them. But yeah, so you need to actually go and have a walk around the plant, have a look at the thing called a weightometer, ask them how often it's calibrated and how it's calibrated. Get to have a quick look at their calibration records. If you're a new geologist to a site, it's always worthwhile doing that exercise. And it's very hard to actually keep these machines in calibration over long periods of time. So that's the first thing. And then the next thing is to ask about their moisture. Moisture coming out of any mine is, variable. If you're in sort of underground tight rocks, it might only be 1 or 2%. If you're in something like a nickel laterite, it's absolutely critical. That can be 10 to 15% of the mass going into the process. So that's the first thing I recommend, and then start looking at the sampling.
Right. Okay, cool. So we know that every processing plant for minerals has conveyor belts. Should we assume that there's no issues with sampling off conveyor belts or between conveyor belts, or should we not assume that? And what are the things we need to look for? Firstly, with the material on the conveyor belt, how does it change along the belt? Secondly, how do we take a sample off the belt? What are the key issues there?
Yeah, so sampling conveyor belts is very problematic in a lot of ways. So we discussed in the previous podcast the sifting segregation and the fact when you look at a conveyor belt, it's always big rocks on the top and fines on the bottom. So there are various devices contrived to sample conveyor belts, and probably the worst is the top belt sampler, which scrapes across the belt like this. And I've actually been in an operation where that was a person who were just grabbing rocks off the top of the belt. It was in Indonesia, so it's just a horrendous sample. But you can have devices that swipe the belt, but the big problem with them is they tend to just leave the fines behind.
Yep.
So we're getting that bias effect. So the right way to sample a conveyor belt is a very expensive device called a cross-belt sampler, where the falling stream from the conveyor has some sort of chute that crosses that. And if you think about that, that's not an easy task if you've got 8,000, 10,000 tonnes of an hour iron ore going through that. Collects a very big sample, and then you then have the challenge of reducing it. But that's the right way to do it.
Then what about actually on the belt itself? Let's suppose we have a bauxite or a nickel laterite mine where the material on the conveyor belt travels a long way, 5-10 kilometres.
Yes.
Is there anything actually on the belt that we need to be concerned about in terms of how the material might change in terms of its nature along the belt?
Yeah, well, this is the time changing frequency. So basically you've got grouping and segregation error due to time, and quite often this will be cyclic. So you need to look at the frequency of the cuts, as they call them, for each sample, and how many cuts are going into a day sample or a half day sample. I did some work on bauxite here in Western Australia, and it was a 50 kilometre long conveyor. And what was happening is they're trying to control silica levels, and so you'd get samples every I think it was 3 or 4 hours back from the plant 50 kilometres away, and then you'd try and react to that to bring the silica level back, at the head of things. So it was a game of moving all the mining equipment basically from hour to hour, or parts of a day, to try and balance that. And that was highly reliant on that sample being actually correct, which is a challenge in itself. The sampling tower was probably 2 stories high, and the size of the sample being collected and then put through a sampling system was huge. So it's a challenging task, but it seemed to work.
So some might say that when we're talking about plant sampling or dealing with plants, there's 2 things in their favour. One is the material's crushed, and secondly, there's a lot of it. Would you say that that's a false sense of superiority or false assumptions? The fact that we're dealing with material that's been crushed and we've got a lot of material and it's relatively homogeneous.
I think your last comment's the important one, the relatively homogeneous. When does it become relatively homogeneous? So quite often head grades aren't calculated by coarse ore crushing. They're usually back calculated to something called cyclone underflow. So this is after the material's been crushed and milled to a pretty fine size and in a slurry, and then the slurry's collected as a proxy for head grade. And that's probably a reasonable method, a reasonable sampling point to get what the head grade might be, because of that fine grain crushing and homogenisation. I don't believe you can get very good samples from very coarse crushed materials, except for something like iron ore and bauxite, where you've got these very big stations, and plus the stuff's very high grade. Then it's 50% iron or 30% alumina, so it's really that homogenisation's the key, and frequency of sampling that's the important part.
So speaking about homogenisation, and apart from product mines that produce a direct product like gold bars, we're talking about concentrates sampling. And
yes.
So what are some issues that we need to think about as a geologist about concentrate sampling? What do we need to look for if we're auditing that process?
Yeah, I think, as I already mentioned, concentrates are actually generally pretty well mixed, and not a problem to even poorly sample to get good results, because they basically have ultrafine particles which are thoroughly mixed and generally about the same density, even though they might be quite dense. So the Pepsi challenge, as I've mentioned there before, is to look at the results you get versus the results that clients get. And these are usually available because the client isn't going to want to accept the concentrate unless they've sampled it, and you're going to want to have an idea of what that grade is. So again, it's just a case of looking at the replicates and then seeing if there's a huge deviation between the two. And rarely it happens in highly concentrated materials, certainly in something like nickel sulfides, which are 20% nickel even.
So in general, you'd say that concentrate sampling is less of an issue, say, than conveyor belt sampling?
Oh, very much so. Yeah, very much so. Again, the big issues in plants is the type of sampler. This sort of tenet that every particle in the stream must get a chance of ending up in the sample is very important. So when you walk around a plant and you see things like these things called shark fin samplers, which are basically just a chute that sits in the middle of a stream, which may be quite wide, you've got to worry that what's being sampled from the middle of the stream may be biased from what's on the margins of the stream due to different rates of flow and density separation. Other issues, like even things like nuclear densometers, which are devices that sit on pipes to measure density, if they're fitted on something like the bend of a pipe rather than on a straight pipe, obviously you're going to get segregation in the flow as it goes around the bend, and the densometer will give you the wrong answer. So it's very technical, but there's a lot of information out there to can educate yourself with these things.
So speaking about that technical issue, and I know you and I have both dealt with lots of metallurgists along the way, and we both acknowledge that they have things to do other than sampling.
Yes.
So what in general would you say about the level of sampling knowledge among metallurgists? Is it insufficient? Do they need to do more? or should we be wrong to make generalizations about that?
Well, despite my dispersions at metallurgists, they're actually very good guys, and they do know a lot, and they understand the mineralogy of the ore very well. Where they get hamstrung, in my experience, is often when a plant is built. There's a process called value engineering, which means make my plant cheaper,
Save money.
and the first thing that goes is really good sampling equipment.
Yeah.
So, quite often they're hamstrung by the fact that rather than having a cross-stream sampler, they've had to have a shark fin sampler. The densometer's been installed in the wrong place. The weightometer is in not the ideal position, and all those sorts of things make it difficult for them. So I think it harks back to really a whole of company management philosophy that once a mine in operation, you can't control what you can't measure. Yeah. And if you're not measuring it correctly, it's probably not in the control that you would like it to be, especially if you're making forecasts to the market that I'm going to produce this amount of material within plus or minus 10%. If your precision of your ore body and plant is not in that realm, it's just crazy.
Speaking about metallurgists and management, I remember I went to one of the IGO mines Nova a few times, and I was very struck by the fact that in the office you had the geology manager, the mining manager, and the metallurgy manager, all with different, all with their offices next door to each other.
Yeah.
How did that work? I think it worked quite well.
I think it works well. They do all talk to each other, and that particular deposit's very complex and relies on careful blending of the ore to get the right recovery and behaviour through the plant. And I think that collaboration issue is very important. And also, pulling in experts where needed, where you're having issues is really the go. You will learn more about your plant and reconciliation when someone comes through and does an audit than you will just trying to understand it in the business, because one, it makes you get your ducks in a row to be audited, and plus you'll just gain all this experience from people like yourself who've seen a lot of things across the industry and can say, well, maybe that's not quite right.
Yeah. Excellent. So what I would say in closing is the metallurgist is your friend. You need to talk to them. They need to talk to you. You need to talk to each other. But as you said, Mark, at the start, they do have different objectives to the geologists.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Mark.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you. So that was our third of three podcasts in the Fresh Thinking series. And if you like them, you can sign up on our website, or you can find them wherever good podcasts are to be found.